Rousseau explained why women love men who don't need them. The man who needs nothing from others is the one everyone wants to give everything to. These words, echoing through centuries from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's revolutionary insights, cut straight to the heart of humanity's most confusing romantic truth. You've witnessed it countless times, perhaps lived it yourself, the desperate pursuit of those who seem completely indifferent to your affection, while those who adore you feel somehow less attractive. This isn't cruelty. This isn't shallow behavior. This is the fundamental architecture of human desire, and Rousseau understood it better than almost anyone who came before or after him. In his groundbreaking work, Émile, Rousseau didn't just observe human nature, he dissected it. With surgical precision, he saw that romantic attraction operates on principles that seem to mock our rational minds. The more desperately someone needs love, the less lovable they become. The more someone demonstrates their independence from romantic validation, the more magnetically attractive they appear. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. Most people spend their entire lives fighting against this truth instead of understanding it. They believe that showing need, demonstrating vulnerability, and making themselves indispensable through emotional labor will win them love. They've been taught that relationships are about mutual dependency, about completing each other. Rousseau would call this thinking the product of a corrupted society, one that has forgotten the natural laws governing human attraction. In the state of nature, he argued, beings are drawn to strength, self-sufficiency, and autonomy. It's only in our artificial social constructs that we've been conditioned to believe neediness equals love. The man who doesn't need a woman's validation doesn't ignore her because he's cruel. He simply operates from a place of completeness that makes him fundamentally more attractive than someone operating from a place of lack. This isn't about playing games or manipulation. This is about understanding the deepest currents of human psychology. You see it everywhere. The successful artist who barely notices his admirers receives more attention than the one desperately seeking approval. The woman who lives fully in her own purpose attracts suitors effortlessly, while the one constantly seeking romantic completion struggles to maintain lasting attraction. Rousseau understood that we're attracted to what we cannot easily possess, not because we're shallow, but because possession of something difficult to obtain signals its value. A person who gives themselves away too easily, who makes themselves too available, who demonstrates too much need, they inadvertently signal their own low value in the marketplace of desire. This is the cruel mathematics of attraction. The equation balances only when one party maintains their independence, while the other seeks to close the distance. Rousseau believed that civilization had corrupted our natural instincts, and nowhere is this more evident than in how we approach romantic relationships. In what he called the state of nature, humans operated from a place of authentic self-interest and genuine independence. But society has taught us that love means neediness, that romance requires dependency, and that showing desperation demonstrates commitment. This social conditioning creates what Rousseau would recognize as a fundamental corruption of natural attraction patterns. We've been programmed to believe that healthy relationships are built on mutual need rather than mutual choice. The difference is everything. When someone chooses to be with you from a place of wholeness rather than need, their choice carries infinitely more weight. It's the difference between someone selecting you because they genuinely value what you offer versus someone clinging to you because they fear being alone. The person operating from choice can leave at any moment, and paradoxically, this possibility makes their decision to stay profoundly meaningful. But here's where most people get trapped. They mistake intensity for depth, desperation for passion, and need for love. A person who cannot live without you isn't demonstrating love, they're demonstrating addiction. And like all addictions, it becomes less attractive over time, not more. Rousseau saw that in our natural state, we're drawn to strength, competence, and self-possession. These qualities signal genetic fitness, emotional stability, and the ability to provide value rather than simply consume it. When someone doesn't need your approval to feel worthy, doesn't need your presence to feel complete, and doesn't need your validation to feel valuable. They're operating from the kind of psychological abundance that naturally attracts others. This is why the advice "just be yourself" fails so catastrophically for most people. If yourself is needy, insecure, and dependent on others for emotional regulation, then being yourself is actually the worst possible strategy. Rousseau would say you need to return to your natural state, the version of yourself that existed before society taught you that your worth depends on other people's opinions. The person who doesn't need love isn't incapable of love. They're capable of offering it from a place of strength rather than weakness. They can love without losing themselves, commit without compromising their autonomy, and give without depleting their own resources. This is what makes them irresistible. Society tells us that relationships should be about completing each other. But Rousseau understood that attraction flows toward those who are already complete. Two incomplete people don't create one whole relationship. They create a mutually dependent prison, where both parties lose their individual identity in service of maintaining an artificial unity. The natural law is clear. We're attracted to what we cannot control, intrigued by what we cannot predict, and drawn to what we cannot easily possess. This isn't game playing. This is recognizing that some truths about human nature are more fundamental than the social myths we've constructed around them. Rousseau understood something about human psychology that modern relationship advice consistently ignores. We assign value based on scarcity, not abundance. When something is freely available, we instinctively perceive it as less valuable. When something requires effort to obtain, we automatically assume it must be worth having. This principle governs everything from economics to art to human relationships, and it's why the person who doesn't need your love receives more of it than the person who desperately craves it. But let's dig deeper into the psychology here. When someone doesn't need you, your lizard brain interprets this as evidence of their high value. After all, if they were low value, wouldn't they be grateful for any attention? The fact that they seem complete without you suggests they have options, resources, and qualities that make them desirable to others. This creates what psychologists call social proof, the assumption that if someone is valuable to others, they must be valuable, period. Conversely, when someone demonstrates desperate need for your attention, your subconscious calculates their market value as low. If they were high value, your brain reasons, they wouldn't need to chase. They would have other options. Their desperation becomes evidence of their lack of alternatives, which signals to your primitive mind that there might be a reason others have rejected them. Rousseau saw this dynamic playing out not just in romance, but in all human relationships. The teacher who needs their students' approval loses authority. The leader who desperately seeks validation loses respect. The friend who cannot survive without constant contact becomes burdensome rather than cherished. This is why playing hard to get seems to work, but only when it's authentic. When someone genuinely doesn't need your validation because they have a rich inner life, meaningful work, strong friendships, and genuine self-respect, their lack of availability isn't a strategy. It's a reality, and that reality is magnetic. The person who has cultivated inner abundance doesn't need to perform independence. They simply live it. They respond to texts when convenient rather than immediately. They make plans that don't revolve around your schedule. They maintain interests, friendships, and goals that exist independently of your relationship. Not because they're trying to seem valuable, but because they actually are valuable. This creates what Rousseau would recognize as natural selection in action. The person who doesn't need you forces you to step up your game. You have to bring something valuable to the table because they're not so desperate for connection that they'll accept crumbs. They're not so afraid of being alone that they'll tolerate poor treatment. They're not so hungry for validation that they'll settle for superficial attention. Meanwhile, the person who desperately needs you removes all challenge from the interaction. There's no mystery to solve, no prize to win, no goal to achieve. They've already surrendered everything before the game has even begun. And humans, being the meaning-making creatures we are, interpret easy victories as meaningless victories. Rousseau understood that the highest form of love comes not from need, but from appreciation. When someone chooses you not because they have to, but because they want to. Not because they're incomplete without you, but because they genuinely enjoy what you add to their already complete life. That choice carries the weight of authentic desire rather than desperate dependency. So how do you become the person who doesn't need love, but receives it abundantly? Rousseau's answer would shock most people with its simplicity. You must first learn to live fully in your own company, to find meaning in your own pursuits, and to build a life so rich and fulfilling that other people become wonderful additions, rather than necessary components. This isn't about becoming cold or unavailable. It's about becoming genuinely self-sufficient in the deepest sense, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually complete. When you reach this state, your relationships transform from negotiations born of need into celebrations born of choice. The person who doesn't need validation has usually spent years building something worth validating. They've developed skills, pursued interests, maintained friendships, and created meaning that exists independently of romantic approval. They've learned to regulate their own emotions rather than expecting others to do it for them. They've built a life they genuinely enjoy living, with or without a partner. This is what Rousseau meant by returning to your natural state, not the artificial dependencies that society has taught you to mistake for love, but the genuine self-possession that makes you attractive in the first place. When you stop seeking completion through others, you paradoxically become the kind of person others want to complete their own lives. But here's the crucial insight. This transformation cannot be faked. You cannot simply act independent while remaining internally desperate. People sense authenticity at levels deeper than conscious awareness. The person who has genuinely built a fulfilling life radiates a different energy than someone performing self-sufficiency while secretly craving approval. True independence requires facing your fears of abandonment, your addiction to validation, and your belief that you're incomplete without romantic love. It means building genuine interests, not just hobbies you think will impress others. It means developing real friendships, not just a network you use to avoid loneliness. It means creating actual meaning in your work, your art, your contribution to the world. When someone encounters a person who has done this inner work, the attraction is immediate and powerful. They're meeting someone who can offer companionship, without neediness, intimacy without possession, and love without desperation. They're encountering someone who chooses them not from a place of lack, but from a place of abundance. Rousseau believed that most human suffering comes from living according to artificial social constructs rather than natural laws. In romance, the artificial construct tells us that love means need, that commitment means dependency, and that passion requires desperation. The natural law reveals that love means choice, commitment means freedom, and passion requires respect. The man who doesn't need women isn't damaged or unavailable. He's simply operating from a place of completeness that makes him naturally attractive. The woman who doesn't need validation isn't cold or unfeeling. She's simply secure enough in her own worth to offer love as a gift rather than extract it as payment for her insecurities. This is Rousseau's ultimate insight. When you stop needing love, you become lovable. When you stop chasing validation, you become valuable. When you stop performing for approval, you become genuinely attractive. Not because you're playing games, but because you've finally learned to play the game of life according to its actual rules rather than the fictional ones society taught you. The person who understands this lives in a different reality than those still trapped in the neediness paradigm. They experience relationships as conscious choices rather than unconscious compulsions. And in making that shift, they discover what Rousseau knew all along. True power in love comes not from being needed, but from being chosen by someone who doesn't need to choose you, but wants to anyway. That is the deepest truth about human attraction and the beginning of authentic love.